This chapter is covering the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton, the entire skeleton actually in the adult, is 206 bones, which seems like a really large amount. But again, you need to remember that a lot of the bones have a right and a left, as well as the bulk of the bones are in the metacarpals, the carpals, and the phalanges. And there's a lot of them. The same with the foot. There's the metatarsals, there's the tarsals, and then the phalanges as well. So this chapter is going to discuss the axial skeleton, which is the central axis of the body that plays a major role in protection. For example, the skull, of course, protects the brain. The vertebral column is going to protect the spinal cord, and the thoracic cage is protecting very important organs like the heart and the lungs. Remember, the pericardium and the pleural cavity are both found in the thoracic cage. The next chapter we'll be discussing in more detail the appendicular skeleton, which is all of the bones hanging off of the central axis. So it begins with the shoulder joint, which is the pectoral girdle, and it also involves the arms and the rest all the way down to the hands, plus the hip bones, which also begins with a girdle. This is called the pelvic girdle, and also the rest of the limbs in the lower extremities. So the upper and lower extremities are all in the appendicular skeleton. So the axial skeleton is including the bones that we see here. There are a total of 80 bones, and you should know the breakdown of each of them. Within the skull, there are a total of 22 bones, 8 of which are the cranial bones. This is what is commonly thought of as the skull cap and includes the frontal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, occipital, sphenoid, and ethmoid bone. The numbers that are in parentheses here are telling you how many of each of those bones we have. The rest of those 22 bones are the facial bones, which are 2 zygomatic bones, 2 lacrimal bones, 2 nasal bones, 1 vomer, 2 inferior nasal conchae, 2 palatine bones, which makes the roof of the mouth, 2 maxilla bones, which are just superior to the mouth, and 1 mandible inferior to the mouth. As well as other bones associated with the skull include the smallest bones in our body called the ossicles. You'll be learning about these in later semesters, but they would include the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. And so there are 3 in each ear, which are listed for you here, and then the hyoid bone. For the vertebral column, there are 26 total bones, and this is in the adult. So during fetal development, there are actually more bones. So there's 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 5 lumbar vertebrae. 1 fused sacrum, 1 tailbone, which is the coccyx, and then the thoracic cage has 1 sternum, which is made up of the manubrium, as well as the body and the xiphoid process. As far as ribs, there are a total of 24 ribs. There are 12 on each side. And a lot of them are going to be connected directly to the sternum, and some of them are not. So let's take a little closer look at this diagram to look at these. We have the skull shown here with different bones, the hyoid bone, the thoracic cage with the sternum, the ribs. And on the posterior view here, which we can see on this side. It's pointing out some of the skull bones as well as the mandible. And on the anterior view, we see different ones. So the skull is composed of these cranial and facial bones, what was kind of summarized on the previous slide. So it's important for you to know that there are 8 cranial bones. They include ethmoid, frontal, occipital, and sphenoid, all of which are unpaired. And the paired ones are parietal and temporal bones. These bones all have the shape of flat bones. Then there are facial bones. There's 14 facial bones that form the face and have no brain contact. The unpaired ones would be the vomer and the mandible, while the paired ones would be the maxillae, nasal bones, lacrimal, zygomatic, palatine, and inferior nasal conchae. So there are many cavities in the facial bone region, as well as the rest of the skull. And so obviously the largest of those cavities would be the cranial cavity, which houses the brain. When we look at an anterior view of the skull here, it's important that you can identify a lot of these different structures, specifically the ones that I'm going to kind of highlight. So definitely the bones. That would be the first thing that you want to work on knowing is the names of the bones. Once you've mastered the names of the bones, then you can start to look at some of those bony landmarks, which were mentioned in a previous chapter. So, for example, there's a little hole called the infraorbital foramen. Remember, foramen is a hole for in this case, a blood vessel or a nerve. There's also a supraorbital foramen, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, alveolar processes, which are for the teeth, and the mental foramen. So you could just focus on the ones that I'm highlighting. This is showing another anterior view of the skull, but it's an image of a model. So I'll go through here and highlight the bones, which are in bold-faced for you. And some of the parts of those bones, again, would be the same thing. Infraorbital foramen, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, alveolar processes, mental, as well as the mental foramen. And specifically, there's a blood vessel that comes through the mental foramen. So it could either be nerves or it could be blood vessels. When we look at the superior view of the skull, we can see the frontal bone, the 2 parietal bones, and the occipital bone in the posterior region. Notice there are joints found between these flat bones called sutures. So it's going to be important for you to know the names of the sutures, like the coronal suture, sagittal suture, and lambdoid suture. Then, of course, the names of the bones, like the frontal bone, parietal bone, occipital bone, zygomatic bone, temporal bone. And we can see the same thing on the right view, right side of your slide. When we look at a posterior view of the skull, we can see the parietal bones, occipital bone, the posterior surface of the mandible, temporal bone, and occipital bone. And then, of course, we see the sutures also, the sagittal suture, the lambdoid suture, mastoid process is an important process that you need to know. If you place your fingers right just posterior to your ear, you can feel a bump called the mastoid process. So a lot of times if you can touch those parts, it will help you to remember where they are at.